Sam, my husband, lost his job recently, but he didn't let it break his spirit. He took care of everything while looking for work, helping our son Max with his homework, and making sure the house was full of laughter despite the uncertainty we faced. From the outside, our life looked like a dream, and others envied us. I used to hear friends tell me how lucky I was to have the kind of family you'd see in a commercial or on a holiday card. We were the perfect family on the outside, but underneath the polished exterior, a slow, creeping discontent had taken hold of me, growing like an invisible crack in a beautiful vase. After months of Sam's job search producing no results, I had returned to work to help make ends meet, and I landed a position at a new, prestigious company. He would bring me fresh white lies, my favorite flowers, and Max, our 10-year-old boy, was the joy of our lives with his bright smile and boundless energy. On my first day, Philip introduced himself and welcomed me personally. It was surprising because the general director rarely interacted with new hires. We exchanged a few courteous words, and I felt a flutter of something I hadn't felt in years. I was nervous and excited, but I also met Philip, the company's general director. He was tall, charismatic, and exuded an air of control that both intimidated and intrigued me. He seemed above everyone, with a sharp wit and a cool detachment. Over the next few weeks, Philip and I continued to cross paths, usually by coincidence, or at least that's what I told myself. It began with small talk in the hallway and progressed to private meetings where he would ask for my opinion on projects outside of my department. It was flattering and intoxicating to be noticed by someone so powerful, and I found myself looking forward to these moments, feeling a sense of validation that had been missing from my life. For the first time in years, I felt noticed as a woman, not as Sam's wife or Max's mother. Philip found me in the break room, staring out at the rain. He leaned against the counter close enough that I could feel his presence. We talked about the weather and the stress of my job, and then he asked about my family. His intense gaze seemed to see right through the layers I had carefully constructed. "You seem different," he said quietly, as if you're carrying a weight no one else sees. Long after I left the office that evening, the weeks stretched into months, and Philip's focus grew more intimate and personal. We would look at each other across the boardroom, find reasons to get coffee, and share secrets in hushed tones that felt electric. I knew it was wrong, but the connection was unmistakable. It was as if he had unlocked a part of me that I didn't realize was trapped, a part that yearned for adventure and excitement. One Friday afternoon, following a meeting, Philip asked if I could stay behind as the office emptied and he closed the door and turned to face me, his face serious. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt a rush of fear and excitement like I was standing on the precipice, and I should have left, but instead I stepped closer, and in that moment, all the guilt I'd been holding inside was drowned out by desire. We shared a slow, passionate kiss that broke any pretense of professionalism, and it felt like a forbidden escape from the routine of my life. From that point on, the affair became overwhelming, and we came up with reasons to meet in isolated areas of the building, locked in desperate embraces. I would come home to Sam and Max feeling hollow, as if I were contributing to someone else's life. Sam was becoming more and more depressed as the job search went on, and I would use that as an excuse, telling myself that I needed this and that I deserved to feel alive again, but the guilt was unrelenting. I would watch Max play, see the innocence in his eyes, and experience a pang of regret so intense that it took my breath away. But I couldn't stop Philip from becoming an addiction. I couldn't give up. One night, I arrived home late, soaked from the rain, and tried to gather myself before entering the house. It was eerily quiet, and Sam was sitting at the kitchen table, his face lit only by the glow of his phone. He looked up, and I knew right away that he knew without a word. He started playing a recording of me saying things I'd only said to Philip, and I felt the blood drain from my face as the realization of what I'd done hit me like a. Sam's quiet resolve scared me more than any argument could have. He hired a private investigator who looked into every aspect of my life and, worse, he discovered Philip's illegal activities. It turned out that Philip was siphoning company funds through fraudulent contracts. Sam was determined to expose him not just for revenge, but to ruin the company. "Freight train, how long?" Sam asked, his voice raw with pain. "I never meant for this to happen," I stammered, tears streaming down my face. "But it did," he said icily. Sam filed for divorce and ruthlessly fought for full custody of Max in court, painting me as reckless and selfish. The judge sided with him, granting me limited visitation, a mere shadow of the life I once had. I moved into a small apartment in the city far from the home we once shared, and the place felt empty, just like me. Philip, the man who had destroyed our family, was arrested after the affair became public, and I was left jobless, humiliated, and alone. Max's once bright, joyful eyes had changed to a sad, inquisitive one, and I wanted to explain this to him, but there were no words that could repair the harm I had done. As the weeks stretched into months, something changed between Philip and me. What had begun as brief exchanges and harmless flirtations took on a new form, and there was a new intensity in the way he looked at me, a heat that simmered beneath his composed exterior in meetings. On me, and when I looked up, our eyes would meet across the room, like a silent conversation that only we could understand. It was exciting, the kind of secret that made my heart race, dangerous, and that danger made it impossible to resist. We found ways to spend more time together, looking for those stolen moments away from our coworkers' eyes. After meetings, we would linger, our hands lightly touching as we passed documents back and forth. He would catch me in the hallway and pull me into a quiet corner to inquire about my day. There was a part of me that felt alive for the first time in years, a part that Philip had awakened without even trying, and he saw through the polished exterior I displayed. His voice was low, his smile was knowing that we would meet for coffee before work, and we were sitting at the small table in the back of the cafe, our knees nearly touching, our voices hushed, as if we were conspirators in some forbidden game. Every laugh and glance we shared felt electric, as if we were playing with fire and daring it to consume us. When everyone else filed out after a long and exhausting meeting, Philip lingered, and I stayed behind too, pretending to gather my notes. But in reality, I didn't want to leave the room because it felt heavy with unspoken words, the kind of silence that envelopes you like a fog when the last person closes the door behind them. The world saw the cracks, and the longing beneath it was as if he had unlocked a door inside me that I hadn't realized was closed, a door that led to a version of myself I thought was lost. His expression was more serious than I had ever seen, and his voice was softer than usual. He asked, "Can you stay for a moment?" I nodded, placing my papers on the table. My heart was thumping loudly in my chest, and I was certain he could hear it. He then walked to the door and turned the lock, which seemed to echo in the silence of the room, as if it were the last barrier to fall away and erase the line we had been tiptoeing around. He stood there for a moment, staring at me as though he were searching. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning, promise, and risk. I felt a rush of excitement and fear, so strong that it made me dizzy. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, with the ground crumbling beneath my feet. I knew I should laugh it off, make an excuse, and leave, but instead I took a step closer and took my breath. He reached out and brushed his hand against mine, and the feel of his skin against mine was like a spark that set everything on fire. We shared a slow, intense kiss that broke down the careful walls we had built around ourselves. It wasn't hurried or desperate, but rather purposeful, as if we were savoring the moment, the forbidden taste of something we knew we shouldn't have. There was no need for words anymore. Everything had already been said in the glances, lingering touches, and shared silences. It seemed as though time had stopped, and that only the two of us were trapped in this moment of pure, unadulterated desire. When we finally pulled apart, I felt as though I had just surfaced from a prolonged submersion. The room was quiet except for the sound of our breathing, and the reality of what we had done settled around us like a chill wind. I opened my eyes to see the look on his face, which was a mixture of tenderness and triumph, as if he had known this would all happen. I whispered, "I'm sorry," but I wasn't sure if I was apologizing to him, to myself, or to Sam, who didn't know what was going on in this quiet, locked room miles from our house. Philip smiled a soft, almost melancholy smile. Don't be. Tracing the line of my jaw. I don't regret it, and neither did I, because in that moment, the thrill of it, the forbidden escape from the routine of my life for the first time in years, dibbed out all the guilt I'd been suppressing. It was like an addiction, the rush of adrenaline, the sharpening of danger, the intoxicating allure of the secret we shared, and after that afternoon, everything changed. We didn't talk about it, made no grand declarations or promises. We just let it happen again and again. It was something other than numbness, something other than the crushing weight of responsibility. I felt alive. With Sam and Max at home, I'd returned feeling like a stranger in my own life. Sam had become more distant and depressed as the job search went on. He tried to hide it by putting on a brave front for Max's sake, but I could see it when he sat at the dinner table listening to Max talk about his day at school. I would feel a hollow ache in my chest, a gnawing guilt that threatened to swallow me whole, but then I would remember how Phil looked at me and how he made me feel, and the guilt would fade into the background, drowned out by the excitement of it all. His shoulders slumped as he stared at his laptop at the kitchen table, and I used his sadness as an excuse for what I was doing, telling myself that I needed this and that I deserved to feel alive again. However, the truth was more sinister than that. I had crossed a line that I couldn't uncross, and instead of turning around, I was diving headfirst into the abyss, not caring what lay at the bottom. It wasn't love, exactly. It was something more primal and raw. Since I wasn't ready to face the consequences yet, I kept moving deeper into the tangled web I'd woven in the hopes that the threads wouldn't break and send everything crashing down around me. At home, though, I knew it was only a matter of time because everything felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened with tension. I had a desperate need for escape, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by the life I'd built with Sam, and the more I fed it, the more it consumed me until almost nothing remained of the woman I used to be. There was a new hollow in his eyes that hadn't been there before, but he was still the same man in many ways, kind, patient, and unendingly dedicated to Max. He would sit at the kitchen table and stare at his laptop screen with an expression I couldn't quite read, as if he were seeing something far away that I couldn't reach. I wanted to console him to close the growing gap between us, but I felt helpless because every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the secret I was. The guilt would hit me like a punch to the gut as I watched Max play in the yard, his laughter filling the air, and I would cling to that justification like a lifeline, using it to drown out the small, persistent voice inside me that whispered, "You're destroying everything." He was so innocent, so blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of our family, and I wanted to cry out to tell him I was sorry, but there was no apology that. It was as though he had taken hold of a part of me that had been starved for so long, and now that it had tasted what it craved, it couldn't go back to the way things were. I was unable to stop and break away from Philip, who had evolved into more than just a distraction. He was a lifeline and an addiction that I couldn't shake. Every time I told myself it would be the last time, I found myself pulled back, unable to resist the pull of that forbidden connection. "I want to see you outside of work," Philip said, his voice low, almost a murmur. "Just you and me, no distractions." Philip asked me to stay behind after a meeting, and it began the same way as before, but this time there was something different in his eyes, a deeper intensity, a promise of something more. He leaned against the edge of the table, his hands casually at his sides, but his eyes were fixed on mine, searching, testing. I felt the floor tilt beneath me, as if I were standing on the edge of the table. Edge of a cliff once more, looking down into a chasm that I couldn't see the bottom of. I knew what he was asking, and I knew what would happen if we went any farther than we had already, but instead I heard myself say yes, the words slipping out of my mouth before I could stop it. He smiled a slow, satisfied smile that made my heart race, and he said, "Tomorrow," as if it were already decided. "I'll text you the address." I nodded, but I couldn't find the words to respond. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The day of reckoning the following day felt surreal, as if I were living through someone else's life. I went through the motions of my morning routine, making breakfast for Max, brushing his hair as he talked about his upcoming field trip, kissing Sam on the way home, and feeling as though I was walking through a fog as I left the office that day. I wondered if he could sense the shift in the air, if he could feel the way everything was about to change. I left the house with a sense of finality, as if I were closing the door on something that could never be reopened. I told myself I wasn't really going to do it, that I would call Philippi and cancel, that I'd change my mind at the last minute and turn the car around. He sipped his coffee with a distracted smile, and his eyes were far away, lost in whatever thoughts were keeping him anchored to that chair. Philip's apartment was in a sleek modern building on the outskirts of the city, far from the cozy suburban life I had built with Sam. It felt like I was entering a different world, one that was full of steel and glass and the smell of pricey cologne. I felt uncomfortable and like an intruder, but when Philip opened the door, all of my doubts were dispelled by the expression in his eyes. He didn't say anything as he dragged me inside and closed the door. As I followed him down the hallway to his living room, the curtains were drawn, casting the room in a dim, intimate light. I felt his hand on the small of my back, guiding me, and the touch sent a shiver down my spine. He turned to face me, his expression softer than I'd ever seen, almost vulnerable. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, and for a moment I felt the weight of everything crashing down. Behind us, there was a quiet click that seemed to seal our fate. On me, the life I was risking, the trust one was betraying, but then he put my face in his gentle hands, and the world seemed to disappear. I nodded, my breath catching in my throat, but I didn't have to because he understood that what came next was inevitable. It was the culmination of everything we had been working toward, the unspoken desire that had simmered between us for months. It was slow and deliberate, a silent agreement that we both knew couldn't be undone, and we didn't need to speak because the silence was filled with 1,000. When it was all over, I felt a strange mixture of relief and regret, as if I had been carrying a heavy burden that I had finally put down and realized how much lighter I had been before I picked it up. Philip held me for a moment, his hand caressing my hair, but I pulled away, the reality of what I had done crashing over me like a wave. "I have to go," I whispered, my voice shaky, and he didn't try to stop me. Instead, he nodded, his eyes full of an understanding that was nearly worse than. The smell of dinner cooking in the oven hit me like a punch to the gut when I walked through the front door of our house. Max ran up to me, throwing his arms around my waist, his face bright with excitement. Sam looked up from the kitchen, smiling softly. I dressed quickly, my hands shaking as I gathered my belongings, and the ride home was a blur, my thoughts racing, and the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. I felt like I was falling apart at the seams, like everything I had held together for so long was coming undone. "You're home early," he said in a warm, unaware voice. I forced a smile, but it felt like a mask covering a stranger's face. "Yes," I said. "Hello, I missed you." I hugged Max tightly, burying my face in his hair and inhaling his familiar scent. Then, the full weight of what I had done hit me, and I felt a wave of regret that almost knocked me off my feet. I had crossed a line that I would never be able to uncross, and there was no turning back. I had become a stranger in my own life. I returned home late one night, the rain seeping through my coat, and the headlights momentarily illuminated a pile of my belongings scattered across the front lawn, clothes, shoes, books, and framed photos lying face down in the mud as I got out of the car. It felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs when I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to piece together what was happening, but I knew deep down that the house was dark except for a single light coming from the kitchen window. Sam was sitting at the kitchen table, hunched over his phone, the screen casting a blue glow across his face. He didn't look up when I walked in, instead sitting there motionless and staring down at the screen as if he were gathering the information. I had never heard our home so quiet before, and as I forced myself to push open the door and climb the stairs, the silence felt heavy and pressing against my chest like a weight. I could see that he had the strength to speak, but as I stepped closer, I could barely hear my heart beating so loudly that I thought of Sam. I whispered, my voice barely audible over the rain beating against the windows, and he looked up. The expression on his face made my blood run cold. It wasn't anger or betrayal, but something much worse, a look of resignation, of quiet, bitter acceptance. Without saying a word, he turned his phone toward me and hit play. The recording continued to play snippets of conversation sounds that made it clear exactly what had happened that day at Philip's apartment. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest as the reality of what I had done hit me like a freight train. My voice filled the room, sounding both familiar and foreign at the same time. It was soft, intimate, and filled with words I had only ever whispered to Philip. Sam's voice was rough and raw with pain. Instead of yelling or demanding answers, he simply asked as if he were worn out by the weight of the question. I swallowed hard, my throat burning with the tears I was trying to hold back. I never wanted this to happen. It was a moment of weakness that had torn apart the very fabric of our lives, and there was no way to take it back or pretend it hadn't happened for how long. However, he said icily, his eyes dark and unreadable, and now we must live with it. His quiet resolve frightened me more than any shouting or argument ever could. There was no place for begging or making excuses when he was that calm. The realization hit me like a kick to the stomach, and I staggered back, holding onto the edge of the table for support. Over the next few weeks, everything fell apart more quickly than I could have predicted, and Sam wasted no time. I watched helplessly as everything I had concealed came to light, and all the secrets I believed I had buried were exposed by the private investigator he hired. However, it wasn't just the affair that the investigator discovered. He also discovered something darker that I was unaware of. Philip had been embezzling thousands of dollars through fraudulent contracts and siphoning off company funds for years. It was a twisted irony that the man I had risked everything for was not only. Sam was determined to expose him as a liar and criminal, not only to exact revenge, but also to destroy the man who had destroyed our family. The fallout was swift and brutal. Philip was arrested. The scandal was publicized in every news outlet, and I was labeled as the woman who had jeopardized her career and her family for a man who was nothing more than a fraud. I was left jobless, humiliated, and all alone. Sam filed for divorce right away, and he didn't hold back. The judge sided with him without hesitation, granting me limited visitation, a mere shadow of the life I had once had. In the aftermath, I moved into a small, cramped apartment in the city, far from the home we shared, far away from the memories I couldn't bear to face. He fought ruthlessly for full custody of Max, painting me as nearly unrecognizable, reckless, selfish, and unfit to be a mother. The worst part was that he wasn't wrong. I had become everything I had promised myself I would never be. Barren was empty, just like me. The lively woman Philip had awakened was gone, replaced by an empty shelf full of regret and self-loathing. I spent most days looking out the window, watching the city go by without me. This was a stark contrast to the stillness inside my own life. I saw Max less and less. He was getting used to his new life with Sam, but every time he came to visit, I could see how he had changed. His once bright, joyful eyes had changed to a sad, inquiring gaze that seemed to be trying to comprehend what had happened to the mother he once knew. I wanted to try to explain to him that it had never been about him and that he had never been the issue, but there were no words that could repair the harm I had caused. The last time I saw him, he was standing at the door with his backpack in his hand, staring up at me with those same sad eyes. "Why did you leave us?" he asked in a small, unsure voice. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come how. He nodded as if he understood more than he should have, and then he turned and left me standing there with the door half open, the sound of his footsteps echoing down the hallway. I watched him go, knowing that I had lost something I could never get back, and as I closed the door, I was unable to explain to a 10-year-old that it wasn't about leaving, but rather about losing myself somewhere along the way. Standing alone in that quiet, lifeless apartment, I realized that the true punishment wasn't losing Sam, my job, or even custody of Max. The emptiness settled in cold and unrelenting. It was the price I had paid for the decisions I made, the cost of the life I had thrown away for a fugitive taste of something I thought I needed. In the end, I wasn't left with passion or excitement, but rather with silence that continued to echo through the empty rooms of my new life, a constant reminder of everything I had lost.